What can turn 9 tons of margarine into a weapon of mass destruction? 24 years later, we still don't know the exact cause of the fire in the Mont Blanc tunnel, but we do know how one fateful decision by rescuers turned a tragedy into a horrific disaster, and how 39 deaths changed the world forever. On March 24, 1999, the Mont Blanc tunnel was a symbol of technological progress and European unity. 7 miles through the heart of the Alps, it was the longest road tunnel in the world at the time of its construction, a link between France and Italy, through which a third of all freight from Italy to northern Europe passed every day. By evening, this symbol of peace had turned into a hellish furnace, with temperatures reaching 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to melt asphalt. The fire raged so fiercely that rescuers were unable to enter the tunnel for 53 hours, and toxic smoke made every breath a deadly danger. 50 people were trapped beneath the Alps. Among the 39 who died were a motorcyclist who drove into the smoke to save a stranger, firefighters who spent 5 hours in fireproof cabins amid the sounds of exploding cars, and ordinary drivers who suffocated in their vehicles, unable to find their way out of the stone labyrinth. This fire forever changed tunnel safety standards around the world. From the Swiss Alps to Chinese megacities, engineers rewrote the rules, remembering the tragedy at Mont Blanc. But this story does not begin with fire and smoke, but with a dream of unity that almost turned into a complete nightmare. In 1907, the Italian Parliament first heard the crazy idea of digging a tunnel through Mont Blanc. Members of Parliament were skeptical, and engineers at the time considered the project technically impossible. It took 2 world wars and half a century of destruction for Europe to understand that unity is more important than pride. In 1959, 2 countries that had recently fought each other began a grand project. French and Italian workers began digging toward each other through 7 miles of solid alpine rock. When the last explosion sounded in 1962 and the workers broke through the final feet of rock, the French and Italians met in the heart of the mountain. Handshakes a mile underground, tears of joy, and champagne under the Alps became symbols of a new Europe. On July 19, 1965, the presidents of France and Italy ceremoniously opened the new route. The tunnel was not just a symbol, it became an economic miracle. Drivers saved 2 hours on each trip and no longer risked their lives on icy serpentine roads. By the end of the 1990s, operators were making huge profits from each passage. A third of all Italian freight to northern Europe passed through the tunnel. Every day, up to 3,000 trucks crossed the border under the Alps, bringing millions into the treasury. But behind this glittering financial success, there were already warning signs that would soon turn into a deadly threat. Experts sounded the alarm as early as the mid-1990s. In 1996, French engineer Jean-Paul Morel stated outright that the tunnel did not meet modern safety standards for such heavy freight traffic. His warnings were ignored. In 1997, the Italian Association of Engineers recommended installing automatic sprinklers and upgrading the ventilation system. The cost of the work was estimated at 50 million euros. At the time, operators considered this too high a price to pay and decided that nothing was more important than profit. Problems piled up, and the ventilation system was operating at half the capacity required for a tunnel of this length. On the Italian side, smoke detectors were constantly being disabled due to false alarms triggered by truck exhaust fumes. Safety rules were violated daily. The minimum distance between vehicles was ignored for the sake of throughput. More cars meant more money. In 1998, the mayor of Chamonix, Michel Charlier, raised the issue of excessive traffic, but his voice was drowned out by the ringing of coins. Over the course of 34 years, there had been numerous truck fires in the tunnel. Each time, the drivers managed to put out the fire themselves and continue on their way. This created a dangerous illusion. If it had worked 16 times, then the system must be working. No one considered that each fire was a warning of a disaster to come. And on that sunny morning of March 24, 1999, fate decided to strike a blow that would change everything we thought we knew about tunnel safety. The morning of March 24th began like thousands of others. Gilbert de Grave, an experienced Belgian driver, loaded 9 tons of margarine and 12 tons of flour into his refrigerated truck. It was a normal load, a normal route from France to Italy. Nothing foreshadowed disaster. At 10:46 a.m., de Grave passed the French border and entered the tunnel. Cameras recorded his truck among dozens of other vehicles. There were already 28 vehicles in the tunnel, 10 cars and 18 trucks with 50 people on board. At 10:49 a.m., oncoming drivers began flashing their headlights. Something was wrong. De Grave glanced in his side mirror and saw white smoke billowing from under the cab. A common problem, he thought, but this time it was different. At 10:53, de Grave stopped right in the middle of the tunnel. It was the worst place to stop, but he had no other choice. Within seconds, his cab was engulfed in flames. The margarine in the cargo compartment began to melt, turning into the perfect fuel for the fire. De Grave jumped out of the burning cabin and ran toward the Italian exit. Behind him, the fire was consuming the cargo, and the temperature was rising rapidly. 50 people were trapped. Those traveling from France couldn't get past the burning truck, and it was impossible to turn around in the narrow tunnel. At 10:55, both exits from the tunnel were closed to traffic. Panic broke out in the control room. There was no communication between the French and Italian operators, and each side was acting blindly. Then someone in the Italian control center made a decision that turned the disaster into hell. They turned the fans on full blast, pumping fresh air into the tunnel. Their intentions were noble, to help people breathe. But the oxygen only fed the flames, turning the tunnel into a giant blast furnace. At that moment, one man made a decision that would make him a hero forever. Pierluca Tenazzi heard the alarm. The tunnel guard, a passionate motorcyclist, didn't hesitate to jump on his motorcycle and head into the smoke. His last words over the radio sounded like a death sentence. "I found the unconscious truck driver. I'm dragging him to safety." Tenazzi dragged the driver to one of the fireproof cabins designed to withstand temperatures of up to 1,472 degrees Fahrenheit. But the flames had already exceeded 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cabin had become a death trap. Both men died, suffocating from toxic smoke containing cyanide gas from the burning wire insulation. By this time, firefighters from Chamonix had already rushed into the tunnel. Their vehicles drove into pitch darkness. The electrical wiring had melted 10 minutes after the fire started, plunging the tunnel into darkness. The combination of smoke, darkness, and vehicles exploding one after another made it impossible to advance. The firefighters were forced to abandon their vehicles and take shelter in fireproof cabins. From there, they heard the sounds of hell, the hissing of melted margarine flowing down the road like lava, the explosions of fuel tanks and tires. Each explosion echoed in the enclosed space of the tunnel, creating an atmosphere of sheer terror. 10 minutes later, Italian firefighters tried to enter from the other side, but they met the same fate. The heat was so intense that it melted the asphalt under their feet. Smoke had already spread throughout the tunnel, making every breath a torture. 5 hours. That is how long 14 firefighters spent in fireproof cabins waiting for help. They heard cars explode one after another with people inside, concrete crack from the unbearable heat, and their colleagues scream into their radios, unable to reach them. Only the 3rd Fire Brigade managed to reach them through a ventilation shaft at 4 p.m. When rescuers finally pulled them to the surface, all 14 men were in critical condition from smoke inhalation. One of them, the commander of the French brigade, died in the hospital, never recovering from his injuries. Meanwhile, the fire continued to rage in the tunnel. It took 53 hours for the temperature to drop enough for rescuers to enter. What they saw resembled scenes from Dante's Inferno. Molten asphalt, charred cars, and 39 bodies of people who had not been able to escape. But even when the flames died down, the scars of this tragedy were only beginning to show. When the smoke cleared, the Alps fell silent. Chamonix and Courmayeur, picturesque towns that had lived off tourism and trade for centuries, were suddenly deprived of their main artery. A third of all cargo from Italy to northern Europe now had to find other routes. Hotels were empty, and restaurants were closing one after another. The economic losses were catastrophic. Italy lost up to 450 million euros a year, while the tunnel remained closed. Local businesses in Chamonix reported a 40% drop in revenue, and some family-run hotels that had been operating for decades were on the verge of bankruptcy. But the most agonizing mystery remained the cause of the fire itself. 70 investigators grappled with an unsolvable mystery, dissecting the charred remains of the truck molecule by molecule and reconstructing the trajectory of each spark. They interviewed 160 witnesses and came up with dozens of theories, ranging from a cigarette thrown from a passing car and caught in the air intake to a technical malfunction or engine overheating. Each theory had its supporters and opponents, but all versions fell apart under detailed analysis. Experts argued until they were hoarse. The lawyers for the 200 plaintiffs demanded concrete answers, and the truth continued to slip away like smoke. The mystery that claimed 39 lives seemed to mock the entire army of investigators. In 2005, 13 people appeared in court, including Gilbert de Graaf, the first person to escape from the burning tunnel, and the heads of companies that had ignored experts' warnings about safety deficiencies for years. The verdict was lenient: suspended sentences, fines, and closed cases, while the victims' families left the courthouse with the bitter realization that justice is a highly relative concept. But while the whole world was looking for someone to blame and calculating the economic losses, the most far-sighted engineers were already asking themselves a much more important question: how to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. While the melted asphalt in the Mont Blanc tunnel was still smoldering, engineers around the world were already drawing up plans for a revolution. The disaster in the Alps was the last straw. Too many people had died because of outdated safety standards. In 2004, the European Union adopted a document written with the blood of the Mont Blanc victims. Every line of this law was a response to a specific mistake that cost people their lives in that March hell. No more disabled sensors, no more separate control centers, no more tunnels without escape routes. The revolution began at Mont Blanc itself. For 400 million euros, the tunnel was transformed into a security fortress. More than 3,000 smoke detectors formed a nervous system that senses the slightest change in the air. 37 airtight shelters with independent air supplies serve as rescue capsules for those who cannot reach the exit in time. An evacuation gallery runs parallel to the main tunnel like a lifeline. But the most important feature is the zone smoke control system. 116 ceiling dampers can isolate a fire in any section of the tunnel, preventing it from spreading. What turned the entire tunnel into a furnace in 1999 can now be localized within a few hundred feet. The effect spread around the world with incredible speed, from Lützburg in Switzerland to Huainan in China, from American tunnels in Seattle to Japanese highways. Everywhere, engineers implemented the lessons learned at Mont Blanc. Robotic fire extinguishing systems, thermal cameras and foam units capable of extinguishing even burning margarine. The first test of the new system took place in July 2005. A truck engine caught fire in the tunnel, just like 6 years earlier. But this time, the sensors were triggered in seconds, the smoke was localized, and firefighters extinguished the fire in minutes. There were no casualties and no downtime. The system, born out of tragedy, proved that what killed 39 people would never kill anyone else. Every March, the roar of motorcycles echoes through the Alps. Bikers from all over Italy gather at the monument to Pierluca Tinacci in Courmayeur, leaving flowers and lighting candles. For them, he has become a patron saint, a man who rode into the smoke knowing he might not return. Quiet memorial ceremonies are held in Chamonix and Courmayeur. Relatives of the victims, surviving firefighters, and local residents gather at memorial plaques bearing the names of the 39 victims. The wound has not healed, but it has taught the world an important lesson. Today, the Mont Blanc tunnel is not just a road under a mountain. It is a fortress of safety, a model to be emulated, living proof that humanity is capable of learning from its mistakes. Every sensor, every refuge, every system is a monument to those who died in the fire. Every time we drive through the modern tunnel with its sophisticated safety systems, we see the legacy of Mont Blanc. Technology evolves, but the memory remains. And in that memory lies the guarantee that such a tragedy will never happen again.